Thank you for coming along to my session. So yeah, I mean, they're not great words, are they? Digital transformation. It probably appears in every single strategy document that you've ever written, but hopefully I'll try and bring it to life for you within the context of Serco and what we do. So let me start by explaining a little bit about Serco. It's an important context. I'm not going to repeat all of these words. We're a business to government company. We focus on delivering services primarily into the public sector. We're a service integrator, not a system integrator. So we don't have an army of technology specialists in the back office. And what we mean by service delivery is there's a particular outcome, there's a particular service that our customers enjoy and our customers enjoy. And in the current economic climate, they decide for whatever reason that isn't core to their business and they want an organisation like Serco to help do it for them. That's to do it better for less is usually the tagline that comes along with that. We like to focus on the better rather than the less, as you might imagine. So we operate internationally. We're in those 4 geographies that you can see, North America, ASPAC, Middle East, UK, and across Europe. And you can see the sectors that we run across as well. So justice, immigration, healthcare, defence, transport, and something called citizen services. Citizen services is a bit of a catch-all for local authorities, for environmental services, for leisure services. So if you look at that, and you look at transport, and you look at some of the other sectors, which include highly sensitive areas, very, very challenging areas. We escort prisoners, we look after people in hospitals, we do immigration services as well as prisons. The diversity is such that it makes my life as a technologist extremely difficult. How do you come up with a consistent technology strategy for an organisation that basically does anything for anybody everywhere? So that was the challenge I had as a CTO, and you'll see how we went along that path and how Appian rose to prominence in our technology stack. So I characterised our use case pretty simplistically, and I would argue that, and it wouldn't stand a lot of scrutiny, that most of you could say, well, doesn't that apply to everything? And of course, it does to many people, and that's because we do lots of things. But ultimately, we have a consumer of our service. And if you look at the NHS, even if you're unfortunate enough to be a service consumer in the prisons, you are consuming a service that Serco is providing. Ultimately, then you have the economic buyer, who is buying on behalf of a government department usually, and is responsible for the quality of that service, the MOD, the Ministry of Justice, for example. But the fact remains that in providing that service, there is a demand for that service that is usually well defined, and what they typically ask us to do is run it within the context of a business process that is often biased towards their own standards and their own quality and policies that they enforce. So the NHS, if we were to run a cleaning service for them, they stipulate various standards around the cleanliness that needs to be observed in the NHS, and likewise in other sectors. So the demand and the service is often consumed within the parameters of our customers. What we then do, obviously, is provide this capability, and we supply and fulfil that service, and the fulfilment of that service usually involves people, it involves the people following a process, and it usually involves assets and maybe third parties of some description. They might be third parties that we have chosen to augment the service that we provide. They may be third parties that we are dependent upon because it's a government service that's being provided, or some other operational system that we are required to update. So good examples there are the Department for Work and Pensions or the custody services. Both have their own kind of case management solutions. So if you're a prisoner, you'll exist in a government database. If you're in the Department for Work and Pensions, you'll exist in a Department for Work and Pensions database somewhere. Naturally, we don't want to take responsibility for that, and we certainly want to be very careful about any data interactions we have for that. So that's a key piece. But we are the glue in between. So we're that integrated service delivery and performance management framework. And the key there is that we want to digitize that. So we want to make that process of execution in delivering that service as automated, as efficient and as streamlined as possible, and where possible, using as fewer humans as possible. Now, that doesn't mean to say that we make people redundant en masse, because we don't. Typically what happens is there are not enough people to do the day job anyway, so they get redeployed on more value-adding activities. Good example of that is nurses. What we do in the NHS gives nurses more time to look after patients, which is what they are really there to do, not for doing some of the admin and some of the logistical support. So that is how I characterise our use case. And if you apply that model to any of our sectors and any of our geographies, that's what we do at a really simplistic level. And so on the right-hand side, the benefits that one sees from a service consumer perspective is they get something that is a great user experience. You know, it's customised and bespoke to them. For the people that are delivering the service, they get more self-service enablement. The economic buyer and ourselves as taxpayers get the financial benefits of being lowest price but remaining technically compliant. And we, obviously, as you would expect, always look to differentiate ourselves against our competitors. And then an interesting statistic you probably saw on the Serco slide. You know, we have circa 50,000 people within Serco as an organisation, and around, this is an average, but around 94% of our staff are all on the front line delivering service. Our central management overhead, our logistical operations, is wafer thin, as it should be, because that's where the value is on the front line. So I use, and I don't know, do any of you use Wardley maps? If I look at that, blank faces, so at least Simon Wardley will be pleased, because he's always plugging this. I use Simon Wardley's mapping technique as a way of understanding situational awareness and asking questions about, is our strategy right? And I encourage you to look it up, it's pretty smart. I plotted that on this simple template. Basically, on the left, going vertically, is the value chain, from invisible to a customer to very visible to a customer. Left to right is commodity on the far right-hand side, utility type services. On the left is Genesis, leading edge, never been done before. And I looked at this model and I said, okay, well, if I've got the service user and the customer right at the very top, citizens like you and I, we need public services. In some cases, we don't have a choice. If I'm being sent to prison, I can hardly choose which prison I go to or whether I go. If you're using your GP, it used to be the case that actually you would just go and use your GP. Now you have an option to choose private services and maybe pay for those. So there's a degree of optionality, but then of course there's the economic buyer and the other components I mentioned. But actually, if you look at the service provider box for ourselves, what do we actually do in Serco? Well, we provide people and we provide assets, as I've described. People perform tasks, they consume external capabilities perhaps, they generate lots of data. And you know what? We weren't the best at collecting lots of data. Now we're pretty good at it. And if I looked at that, the real differentiation, our sweet spot, if you will, is how do you configure those services? How do you integrate those services and bring them together in a way that the end user feels that they're getting a value-added service? Because at the end of the day, a lot of our services are underpinned by blue-collar, not particularly specialist practices. They're cleaners, they're caterers. Might be slightly more on the engineering side and so slightly more specialist. But a lot of our services are commodity-type services. So if we are going to really disrupt how that service is delivered on the basis of mostly a commodity delivery play, then what we need to do is we need to look at what part data plays and what part platforms play. And platforms are where our services come together in a slightly more exciting and interesting way. hence Appian being a core platform provider for us. So I thought I'd explain that to try and give you some context around the tactics of our strategy. So the use case, an example, and we run, just as a backdrop, this is an example in the UK, but we run the Affordable Care Act. A lot of you will know it as Obamacare. That's run entirely, on the Appian platform. Not entirely, but pretty much entirely on the Appian platform. So that underpins the whole of that service. This particular example is far smaller, but no less critical. For the Ministry of Defence, we look after RAF bases. We do a variety of things on RAF bases. And this particular one relates to a base in Oxfordshire where we do a number of services, as you can see there, air transport, air-to-air refuelling, etc. That's what they do, and they have a number of different aircrafts as well. We, as a service provider, have a number of tasks that they want us to do. They want us to move aircraft, to refuel aircraft, to inspect equipment, to make sure it is ready, and they want us to help escort people on site. There's almost a mini airport, if you will. On the flip side, there are a number of high-value assets that we look after, aircraft, vehicles, all sorts of equipment. And there's processes that the customer employs that we have to then implement in order to make sure that an aircraft is ready to take off, or to make sure that a runway is ready to receive an aircraft, etc. And that kind of process, if you can imagine our RAF base, it's the middle of winter, it's things like going out and de-icing the aircraft so it can fly. And the people that do that are typical engineers, hard-working engineers. They have no time for technology that isn't helping them. Frankly, they don't have time for technology. Look at it and think, what on earth do I need that for? So there was a real business change aspect to transforming how they think. And why should they be taking a mobile device out to them on the runway? And what you have to really do is dig into the psyche and say, well, how are we helping to make their life easier? And how are we presenting it in such a way that it makes it easy for them to do business in very harsh conditions? So we looked at these RAF Base Requirements, and our solution for them was based on a mobile-enabled field force model that we brought to life. So if we look at the challenges, what did they have today? They were doing lots of manual work, built on legacy systems, needed to be compliant with a customer, with customer systems, with customer processes. Lots of Microsoft Excel going on. Let's be honest, who doesn't have lots of Microsoft Excel running parts of their business today? There was a paper trail, but it wasn't always as predictable as you would like. So the level of insight they would get as to how their processes were running and were they being efficient was actually quite limited. And where they were using paper, there was a lot of manual form filling, as you might imagine. So that just introduces a margin of error into the whole process. So we looked at this and said, how do we digitize the process, take paper out of the equation? How do we, as part of that, help the guys on the front line become more compliant with their processes so they don't forget things, and these are important things. How do we put a ruggedized device in front of them that is intuitively designed, that means it's really easy to use and it helps them do their job? And more importantly, how do we do that with a client base who doesn't care for engineering, doesn't care for technology, isn't a specialist in systems integration or software development, and frankly, nor are we, because as the IT community, as I said, we're a service integrator, we're not a systems integrator. I do not have an army of developers sitting there waiting to do work for me. So we look very careful at this, and remember my strategy slide previously, I was looking for a platform that could bring to life business applications that was primarily about representing a business process that someone had to follow. Resulting from that process were tasks that we want people to do, and we'd have to bring other resources and assets to bear on it. And we wanted to make it mobile enabled using a variety of ruggedized devices with the minimal amount of effort. And my aspiration, we were talking at a CXO round table yesterday, my aspiration is actually to have virtually no, if any, IT department at all, because that's not what we need. So I favour having a really thin service integration and management layer supported by specialist partners and train our business community to be more self-sufficient in representing the business process in a platform that they can easily do that on, but still be constrained so they don't do things that might be architecturally wrong or get them into trouble. So I want our IT department to be virtually nothing. So we looked and we favoured, when it came to the solution, a low-code platform, because what we wanted to do was put the power of the business process in the hands of the end users that were going to use it. We wanted to recognise the fact that there was a case management, business process management aspect to the solution. We were, after all, following a business process. And optimising that process and what that meant for the tasks that they did was key to transforming how they worked. We wanted to make sure that there was a mobile solution, standard mobile device, ruggedized, that we could put in their hands. They could get clear instructions about jobs and what was required. And in the back office, we replaced those manual forms and very little insight with far greater operational insight and data that we could enrich and analyse after the fact as well. So that's how we turned what was a very manual process with manual forms into a mobile-enabled digital process that guided people through their tasks. And how did we do it? Well, we looked at an agile delivery method. We got some partners involved. We co-located our staff on the RAF base. So, and I can picture it now. If you go to the RAF base, there's a building where a lot of these engineers will congregate. At the back of it, there's sofas and there's a TV and there's Xboxes. That's where they go to rest. It's like their tea room, if you will. We plonked ourselves just on the outside of that, so we were in their world, if you like. And we set up this empowered, integrated team, along with, and this was one of the most critical roles, a user experience lead who helped not translate what they were saying into what the program did, but help guide them. Frankly, the engineers who were using this mobile application that we built, designed the application. We guided them through workshops into how to do it in the same room that they'd be drinking their tea and biscuits and playing the Xbox. So it felt comfortable to them. It didn't feel like there was anything being done to them. It felt like they were co-creating this application. And they knew their process, and we could help guide them as to what might work better. And in fact, often what we found was they themselves would say, actually, we can do that better by doing it a slightly different way. So the model that we deliver, the way we delivered it was key. It was a 12-week end-to-end cycle with a series of sprints, as you might expect. The resulting user base was 65 users in total. We had partners that helped us guide us through the actual development of the configuration of the Appian platform itself. And we had a set of operational stakeholders who were also involved because they were interested in what data were we going to collect and how would that prove useful from an operational perspective, especially when it came to optimization. The feedback from, I guess, most importantly, the end users that were using it was great. Otherwise, if they didn't use it, it would fail regardless. And then closely following that, our customers gave great feedback as well, because what they saw was a far more efficient service, operational insight into the process, some processes that they had long held as being pretty standard and optimized. In fact, we went a bit further with them. And we ended up with a solution and a platform that we could then scale and do more things with if we wanted to. So this didn't have a huge amount of external integration. but it provided the platform for that as part of their broader strategic endeavours. And it started to build a digital core that kind of implements that very simple use case model that I described, that says we want consistent engagement at the front end, a glue of orchestration and business process management in the middle, and strong integration at the back end with an underpinning data architecture that meant we instrumented everything and collected everything so that we could measure it and manage it and do greater things with it. So what did that mean in terms of Serco? So that was just a case in point. The work we do with the Affordable Care Act is another classic. This is now forming a core part of our enterprise strategy. As I said, this low-code model suits us well. And we are now using this digital core and this pattern, if you will, to continue, as our strategy says, to reimagine how public services get delivered elsewhere into other sectors and into other customers. Because frankly, with the options I had were, given the diversity of the business, do we go out and buy lots of commercial off-the-shelf products that are ideally suited to this use case or this use case? I could do that. That would be easy. I'd probably have 360 commercial off-the-shelf applications at least, one for every contract almost. It would, and what we found was invariably, what the COTS product provides is never quite right for the business. And so you get kind of organ rejection with them. Whereas if you can say to them, actually, you can get all the benefits of a speed to market approach, but using a low-code environment that means that you can be part of configuring that business process. They see it in a different light. So we're using that to deliver greater innovation. At the forefront of what we do with being service delivery it's about that enhanced customer experience. As I said, a lot of the work we do in hospitals, in facilities management, means that we give more time back to the nurses and less so, but to the doctors as well. But actually, when you look at the interactions that we have in a healthcare setting, you will see a Serco person in a hospital far more times than you will a nurse. So actually, the more we can do to make that process of how we look after them easier, better, a more pleasurable experience, it's proven to deliver better patient outcomes in the long term as well. So customer experience is important, and then of course we want to intelligently leverage that business process automation that we see as being key for efficiency, driving efficiency of course. Now we don't want to keep, as I said, buying these COTS products, nor do we want to keep configuring new instances, so there's this balance around reuse and building on top of a core Appian platform, lots of modules that suit our own needs, and of course the byproduct of that is that we get to scale the benefits of digitization and promote the principle of integration, not invention, ultimately. And then if you look at that and you look at the service experience as well as some of these more technical enablers, what you find is that there are almost unintended benefits. So just taking paper out of the equation, for example, just a really simple example, means that not only do they don't have to handle paper anymore, you don't have to buy paper anymore, and you don't have to store paper anymore, and you don't have as many GDPR type challenges because of the right it extrapolates. So we don't have Iron Mountain boxes costing us hundreds of thousands of pounds full of paper because we just don't need it anymore. So there's all sorts of other benefits, as well as just always remaining safe and compliant and auditable, of course. So we could have looked at other platforms, and indeed, like many enterprises, I was speaking to a lady from HSBC. We had others. We have an Office 365 platform globally. We have ServiceNow. We have Dynamics. And Dynamics is a classic example. They'll proclaim to be able to do low-code type environments. They can't really. Not to our experience. Not yet. So what we wanted was a platform, and I won't list all of those, but gave us ultimately this really simple configuration-based view. It allowed us to do integration across the piece, and we're using that to good effect in terms of, in some cases, sitting across legacy products and then presenting a far more efficient and user-friendly user interface, but actually then chasing down particular value streams that deliver benefit without us having to re-engineer or reinvent a legacy product. We can choose where and how we introduce some of that efficiency, and the net result of that is for lower cost, we can get the value from better integration, and over a period of time slowly wean ourselves off some of these legacy products that we inevitably have within our estate. And then the other piece, over and above integration, and obviously RPA fits in that, is this idea of instrumenting everything and then being able to dip into data sources without having to pull data out, because that has all sorts of connotations as soon as you start to take ownership of data, which in our cases can be quite sensitive. We can get all the value of the insight and of the instrumentation of our data processes and that big data foundation, and be able to put AI and greater analytics over the top of it. More analytics than AI, if I was to be honest, because we're certainly not pushing the limits of artificial intelligence yet. And then from a commercial perspective, we needed to make sure that there was a partner who is ready to invest time in understanding our model, to recognise that the licensing modelling they had didn't necessarily best suit us. We wanted almost a value-based licensing model. We had a partner, Matt came in, met our chief exec and made this commitment to support quick wins. And I've had, Charlie and Richard by my side throughout all of this. So really strong, broad engagement across Serco, and focusing on not just Serco, and it didn't feel like they were focusing on just Serco and winning a deal. It felt like they were part of the outcome that we were trying to deliver, and that was important from a partnership perspective. So our future strategy in the final slide, and I'm between you and John Cleese, and he's a lot funnier than I am, is what we're going to do with Appian going forward. So we're obviously going to continue to build these solutions. As I said, it's the underpinning component of our digital core that goes across all the sectors in which we work. We're creating an R&D lab to encourage experimentation on the Appian platform, as well as looking at what does a centre of excellence mean for us, recognising that we've got this partner relationship and we don't want an army of expertise. We're also blending in, it's not on there, but we have something called Experience Labs, which looks at user experience from a psychological outcome base. And we're saying, well, what does business process re-engineering look like when you start to employ that side in a business process and how it touches real people? And then naturally, I see a prosperous future as we continue to develop our partnership.